Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for your ears. In the spring of 1834, a traveler stepped onto a farm road in central Virginia and walked straight into a nightmare buried beneath 2 decades of silence. The Sullivan farmhouse stood like a portrait of rural decency. White clapboard walls, wraparound porch, smoke curling from its chimney. Yet under its kitchen floor stretched a chamber built for human captivity. 47 children, chained, whispering the same name in the dark, Mother Sullivan. Their voices were so faint that even the rats ignored them. You weren't supposed to know about this place. Men resigned their badges, pastors burned their sermons, and archivists buried the reports under false dates. But now the record is unsealing, and I'm handing you the key. As you picture the rolling hills of Virginia, strip away every postcard image of antebellum charm. Replace it with damp stone corridors, iron rings hammered into walls, and the smell of starvation leaking through floorboards. The Sullivan basement wasn't a single room. It was a labyrinth. Its ceilings low enough to force children to hunch, its walls mortared to drink their cries. Every inch was engineered not for storage, but for control. Most people want to believe evil wears horns and announces itself. But here, evil wore a bonnet, baked cornbread, and quoted scripture about mercy. Constance Sullivan's soft voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. She built her reputation like a fortress. Charitable, maternal, the savior of orphans. And because the community needed that story to be true, no one looked closely enough to see the chains hidden just below their feet. You're already inside the rabbit hole, even if you don't realize it. With every word, you're stepping deeper into a secret the state of Virginia once tried to erase. You think you're just watching a video, but this is a test. Do you really want to see how far this goes? Most people click away at the threshold, but if you stay, you'll discover why these children were taken, who they were meant to become, and the machinery of power that still echoes today. The first thing you must understand is that the Sullivan basement wasn't just a crime scene. It was a blueprint. Every stone, every corridor, every padlock was a lesson in how to take control of a human mind. What began as hidden child imprisonment in 1834 Virginia was a demonstration of a much older idea. When you cage the body, you begin reshaping the identity. Constance Sullivan didn't invent this system. She simply perfected it for her time and place. The whispers the children repeated in that darkness were fragments of indoctrination, broken syllables of a ritual designed to erase their past and graft on a new obedience. Even in death, some of their teeth were filed down, their hair cropped to uniform lengths, their names replaced by numbers in ledgers. Think about that in a quiet farming community, under a house the neighbors called a place of Christian charity. A micro-state existed, an underground society with its own laws, punishments, and symbols. 47 children chained, but not randomly. They were arranged by age, gender, and perceived compliance, just like an army. This wasn't just captivity. It was recruitment. But for what? That's the question the surviving records hint at without answering directly. When investigators first descended those steps, the children's eyes were already empty of expectation, but not of programming. Even as chains clattered to the ground, several refused to leave, trembling at the threshold, as if stepping out would mean annihilation. That's how deep the psychological work had gone. The Sullivan method was not simply to hide them physically, but to reformat their inner world, so escape would feel like death. And here's where you begin to glimpse the larger pattern. What happened in that basement isn't some isolated evil sealed in the past. It's a diagram showing how institutions can disguise control as compassion, how communities can accept chains if they're hidden under the right story. Every generation has its own basements, its own locked rooms dressed up as salvation. The Sullivan case is just one of the earliest you're being allowed to see. You're already deeper than most men ever dare go. In the next descent, we'll strip away more of the mask and reveal why the numbers in Constance's ledgers were never just numbers, but signals to a network bigger than her farm. Look deeper now, because what you're about to hear pulls you past the edges of any ordinary crime. The ledgers found in that basement weren't the tidy notes of a farmer's wife. They were written in a cipher of initials, dates, and symbols, triangles, circles, and black crosses, marking each child's arrival, obedience level, and something else the investigators could never fully decode. The pages smelled of smoke and bitter herbs, as if they'd been sealed in some ritual space. Scholars who have examined surviving fragments whisper that the codes resemble older European trafficking systems that moved not just bodies but ideas, customs, beliefs, bloodlines. Whether Constance Sullivan learned it from someone else or invented her own hybrid system, she had mastered the art of cloaking a trade network as charity. Think of it: a farmhouse in rural Virginia, acting like a node in a hidden lattice, connecting poorhouses, orphan asylums, and backroom brokers. This was the early Republic's underworld. No electric telegraphs, no photographs, just word of mouth, sealed letters, and cash. A perfect environment for a predator who understood that records could be burned and witnesses silenced. By the time Sheriff Crawford and his deputy burst through that cellar door, more than 2 decades of transactions had flowed through that underground vault. Each child a number. Each number a future erased. But what makes the Sullivan basement truly dangerous knowledge isn't just the horror of its past. It's the mirror it holds up to now, because the same architecture of control still exists, dressed in modern clothing institutions, promising protection while siphoning your agency, algorithms reshaping your attention while claiming to connect you. Constance Sullivan's chains were iron. Today's chains are invisible, but their function is the same: to keep you compliant, obedient, and unaware of your own captivity. As you're hearing this, your mind is already wrestling with 2 realities, the official story and the hidden one. That tension you feel in your gut, that's the first crack in the surface. Keep it. Feed it. In the next section, I'll show you how the Sullivan family's techniques of isolation, repetition, and identity erasure map onto the larger systems you live inside right now. Systems that feed on silence the same way their basement fed on children. This is where the descent begins to feel personal. Now we move from structure to technique. The cold mechanics Constance Sullivan used to break human beings and remake them in a shape she could command. Notice how simple the toolset was: darkness, routine, scarcity, and a single authoritative voice that never wavered. Strip away the period clothing and the stone walls, and what you are left with is a protocol any system can adopt. Isolation severs a person from memory and witnesses. Repetition routinizes obedience until choice feels alien. Scarcity makes every concession priceless. And a constant, soft-spoken authority rewrites moral coordinates until cruelty reads like care. These are psychological levers as old as power itself. And Sullivan pulled each one with surgical precision. Imagine a child waking to the same dim light, hearing the same single voice telling them what they are allowed to want. Imagine being fed the same thin porridge, given the same tasks, and punished for the faintest divergence. Your name, if you ever had one, becomes a sound that earns pain. Your past is an H you learn to hide. After months, then years, the mind begins to prioritize survival over memory. Identity narrows to the perimeter of the chain. This is not conjecture. It is the predictable result of applied control. The Sullivans understood the human thermostat: lower external stimuli long enough, and the internal temperature of resistance drops. But psychology alone does not explain the endurance of such a system. There was social engineering at work. How to manipulate a community to make the basement invisible. Constance curated a public persona, so convincing it acted like camouflage. She attended church in the morning and sat with neighbors at the store in the afternoon. By night, she fed a narrative of grief and charity that sealed the mouths of gossip. People want simple narratives. Give them a savior story, and they will refuse to see the crime beneath it. That interplay, private cruelty, public sanctimony, is a pattern you will recognize if you look for it in institutions that glare holy while their basements operate in secret, leaders who laugh in parlors and arrange disappearances in shadow. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking this is confined to a bygone era. The same choreography, mask virtue, privatize harm, normalize silence, plays out in far more sophisticated theaters today. Replace cornbread and candles with glossy PR, legal teams, and curated testimony. Replace padlocks with contracts, algorithms, or social fear. The instruments have modern names. The goal remains identical: keep the many compliant and the few unquestioned. You are watching the anatomy of that transformation. Stay with me, because next, we'll examine the specific rituals used underground in Millbrook and how those rituals evolved into bureaucratic rites that still bind men who think themselves free. You've seen the chains and the ledger. Now we enter the ritual. Down in that basement, control was never only physical. It was symbolic. Constance Sullivan understood the power of repetition and meaning. Each dawn, if you can call the stale oil lamp glow dawn, the children were forced to stand in rows, their backs to the stone, their eyes downcast. She would speak phrases in a low, measured tone, blending scripture, commands, and invented words. Over time, those phrases became a private language, replacing the children's original tongues, smudging their memories like damp ink on a page. This was not care. It was programming. Every new arrival began with a naming ritual. Birth names were erased. New names were assigned based on numbers and signs, sometimes etched onto a wooden disc hung from the neck, sometimes cut into cloth sewn into their rags. These weren't mere identifiers. They were anchors, symbolic shackles. Once the child accepted the new name, their past dissolved. Investigators found dozens of these discs scattered in the dust, wooden tokens carrying numbers far beyond 47. That's how they learned there had been many more before. But here's the darker revelation. The rituals weren't only about dominance, they were about conversion. The Sullivan method imprinted a hierarchy. Obedience earned scraps of food, warmth, or momentary reprieve. Defiance earned cold silence or punishment. Over months, the children internalized this rhythm until punishment felt inevitable and obedience felt like safety. In their eyes, Mother was not captor but axis. Everything revolved around her will. This is why some children, even after the cellar door swung open, could not step forward. Freedom felt like falling off the earth. This is the architecture of mental captivity. It does not vanish when the physical chain is removed. It survives as reflex, as loyalty to the very hand that harmed you. And here is where it mirrors your own world. Every advertisement, every curated feed, every subtle nudge works by the same logic. Break the link to your original sense of self. Offer identity tokens, then train you to crave the reward of compliance. If you've made it this far, you're already resisting the surface story. Halfway down the rabbit hole, pause and seal your transformation. Comment the phrase, "No more hidden basements." Twice below, lock it in. Declare to yourself and to the algorithm that you will not sleep through the next revelation. Because in the next descent, we strip away the last illusion about who was truly behind the Sullivan farm. Now that you've crossed the threshold, it's time to confront the question every investigator feared to ask. How could one family sustain such a machine for over 2 decades without powerful friends, without patrons, without someone higher up shielding them? The Sullivan farm was not an island. It was a spoke in a wheel, feeding and drawing from currents no one in Millbrook could see. Among the papers retrieved from the basement were receipts, ledgers, and sealed letters bearing initials no one could match to local citizens. Some bore foreign postmarks. Some used aliases later tied to county officials. Every scrap hinted at a network moving through banks, brokers, and backroom deals laundering human suffering into quiet profit. Look at the timing. 1812 to 1834. Years of American expansion, land speculation, and a rising appetite for cheap labor and compliant bodies. The Sullivan system offered something beyond labor. It offered conditioned humans, minds scrubbed of identity and primed for obedience. That idea has never died. In every generation there are those who see people not as lives but as raw material. That is why the Sullivan story matters now. It's not just a grotesque footnote, it's a prototype. Even the layout of the basement reflected larger power structures. Children closest to the stairs, those most compliant, were fed and clothed better. Those furthest back, near the crawl spaces, were punished with hunger, cold, and sensory deprivation. A gradient of privilege inside captivity. Sound familiar? That's how modern hierarchies work too. Create tiers of reward and punishment inside one enclosure, so the captives police each other, without needing constant force from above. When Sheriff Crawford began to pull on these threads, he quickly met resistance. Documents disappeared. Witnesses retracted statements. Judges hesitated to issue warrants. The deeper he dug, the more it became clear some truths are protected not by secrecy, but by collective unwillingness to see. This is why forbidden history fades from textbooks. This is why archives burn. Understand this: the Sullivan basement is not only beneath your feet, it's inside your institutions, inside your culture, inside your own habits of obedience. To see it is to start pulling free. In the next descent, we'll uncover how those same psychological levers you've just learned, gradients, ritual, and identity erasure, now operate invisibly around you, and how to recognize them before they finish their work. Here's the point where the past stops being a horror story and becomes a mirror. Everything the Sullivans built underground was a test site for principles still at work today. Principles hiding in daylight with polite names like policy, best practices, or behavioral science. The same steps constants used on children, ritual, scarcity, gradients of privilege, are now embedded in systems that measure your attention, shape your choices, and predict your responses. Instead of padlocks, you're given dashboards. Instead of shackles, you're given notifications. The cage becomes invisible because it feels like a service. Look at how it operated in the basement. Every day the children were conditioned to anticipate a sound, the key turning, the voice calling, the food sliding through. That sound became their clock, their cue, their only sense of normal. Remove the cue and panic set in. This is the same mechanism in modern engagement loops. The small dopamine spikes designed to keep you checking, scrolling, obeying. Once your mind starts orbiting a cue, you're already halfway chained. And there was another layer: identity replacement. Constance did not merely feed and punish, she gave symbols. She removed names and assigned tokens. Today that role is played by avatars, scores, badges, and algorithms assigning you categories you never asked for. Consumer, target, demographic. The technology is more sophisticated, but the principle is identical. Control the frame, and you control the self. Why does this matter? Because if you don't see the pattern, you'll mistake captivity for comfort. You'll confuse the giver of rewards with the source of freedom. The Sullivan basement was a brutal, physical warning, but the warning applies everywhere. Once you understand how conditioning works, you begin to see who benefits from your habits, your silence, your clicks. Now pause and breathe. Notice how your own routines feel when they're disrupted. Notice the cravings that rise when your usual cues vanish. That sensation is a modern echo of what those children felt beneath Virginia soil. It's your nervous system learning who its real master is. In the next descent, we'll break apart the architecture of mass influence itself. How the same dark psychology travels upward from basements to boardrooms, from whispered rituals to public policy, shaping not just individuals but entire nations without a single iron chain in sight. Now the descent reaches its deepest chamber, the point where the Sullivan blueprint and today's institutions converge. Imagine the basement flipped upside down. Instead of stone walls, think marble lobbies. Instead of a single captor, think entire committees, task forces, and think tanks. Instead of chains, think contracts, fine print, and digital profiles that track you more tightly than any iron shackle. This is how the old system scaled up. The techniques Constance used on 47 children became templates for controlling thousands, then millions. Change the vocabulary, change the packaging, but never change the function. Every influence machine today rests on three pillars: the Sullivans mastered isolation, ritual, and a hierarchy of rewards. Isolation now appears as hyper-personalization. Each of us locked into an individualized feed, convinced it's reality, unable to see beyond our own corridor. Ritual shows up as routine engagement. The predictable scroll, the daily login, the constant cycle of updates and notifications. The hierarchy of rewards is built into metrics, rankings, and the soft panic of falling behind. Together these levers shape behavior as reliably as the key in Constance's hand. The deeper truth is that you're not just being marketed to, you're being trained. Every platform, every loyalty program, every gamified challenge teaches your nervous system to accept incremental control in exchange for micro rewards. Your digital footprint becomes a ledger of compliance. Each interaction a token, each click a number, just like the discs found in that Virginia basement. Most men will never notice. They'll laugh at old ghost stories, certain they're immune, as they live inside a cleaner version of the same basement. But you, hearing this now, are already past the threshold. You've seen the pattern, you're holding the map. And once you see the map, you can't unsee it. So what's the cost of this knowledge? Discomfort, alienation, the realization that some comforts were cages all along. But the benefit is power, the ability to see the strings before they tighten. In the next descent, I'll reveal the mechanisms of soft punishment, how systems don't need violence to maintain obedience, and how those mechanisms echo the subtle, merciless conditioning Constance Sullivan refined in her underground warren nearly 2 centuries ago. Now we enter the territory of soft punishment, the invisible discipline that holds a population in line without ever drawing blood. Constance Sullivan understood it instinctively. She didn't have to beat every child every day. She only had to beat one in sight of the others, or withhold food for long enough that hunger became self-policing. The rest of the children learned to discipline themselves. This is how power becomes efficient. Teach the captive to anticipate pain, and they will regulate their own behavior to avoid it. Modern systems do exactly the same thing with reputation, access, and opportunity. They don't need to chain you. They only need to make you fear losing the small rewards you've been trained to crave. Look at your own world. You're offered visibility, credit scores, social status, follower counts, discounts, exclusive access. Each of these is a small piece of bread slid through the slot. Step out of line, and the bread vanishes. No one yells. No one knocks down your door. You simply fade into obscurity, flagged, shadow banned, denied, or priced out. This is the same rhythm as the basement, only cleaner, quieter, more plausible. Constance also perfected uncertainty as a tool. Punishments arrived on irregular schedules, so the children never knew which action would trigger pain or reward. This randomness intensified compliance because the brain starts scanning constantly for hidden cues, desperate to predict the next shock. Today, randomness appears as shifting rules, changing algorithms, sudden policy updates. The unpredictability keeps you hooked and self-monitoring, just like those children in the dark. The most devastating effect of soft punishment is identity collapse. Over time, the captive internalizes the captor's rules until self-censorship feels like virtue. They start to defend the system, shame outsiders, and enforce norms on each other. This is why, When the cellar door opened, some children would not step into daylight. They had been rewired to believe freedom itself was dangerous. Now pause and recognize what you're feeling. This is not a horror story for its own sake. It's a decoded manual. The Sullivans demonstrated a template for invisible control, one still operating at scale. In the next descent, we'll uncover the final layer, how myth, narrative, and public spectacle disguise power, making entire societies thank their captors while locking the door themselves. You've seen how the Sullivan basement operated on bodies and minds. Now you must see how myth operated on the world above. Constance knew that power without a story is brittle. She wrapped her cruelty in a narrative of mercy, the same way today's institutions wrap extraction in the language of opportunity or security. This is the last veil, the place where fact becomes theater, where power scripts the very meaning of events, so no one even calls it captivity. Upstairs, the Sullivan farmhouse looked like a beacon of virtue. Visitors saw a modest woman, a hard-working husband, and the image of Christian charity. Downstairs, an industrial experiment in domination. That split, public virtue, private exploitation, is the essential operating system of elite control. It works because people are trained to prefer a beautiful lie over an ugly truth. As long as the facade is intact, even evidence will be reinterpreted to protect the story. That's why neighbors dismissed the crying, why the doctor accepted excuses, why the sheriff hesitated for years. Myth isn't just propaganda, it's ritualized blindness. Modern systems do this with branding, slogans, and carefully staged outrage or compassion. The goal isn't to convince you of a single claim, but to immerse you in a mood, a shared emotional field. So dissent feels like blasphemy. Once that field exists, the captives start defending the captor, because the captor embodies their cherished story. Consider the myths you're inside right now. Economic myths, national myths, personal myths. Which of them would you fight to defend, even if evidence tore holes in them? Which give you a sense of safety or identity? That's the cage. The Sullivan basement was simply a prototype with stone walls. The myths above it were the blueprint for scaling the operation without walls at all. By exposing this pattern, you're already dismantling part of its hold on you. You're noticing how easily a story can hide a cell, how quickly a narrative can make cruelty seem normal. This is the doorway to power, the ability to see without the lens of myth. In the next descent, we'll confront the final revelation, how the same mechanics that chained 47 children can bind entire populations, and how breaking the story is the first step toward breaking the chains. Here is the last descent, the point where the basement, the myth, and the present moment converge. Up to now we've traced the Sullivan method as if it were a relic, but it's also a living process. The same psychological levers Constance used, scarcity, ritual, gradients, soft punishment, and myth, did not vanish with her arrest. They evolved into systems so large we mistake them for reality itself. This final layer isn't about a single villain. It's about a structure we've all been trained to inhabit. Seeing it clearly is both frightening and liberating. Think of the Sullivan basement as a miniature model. Now imagine it scaled to a city, a nation, a global feed. The walls become invisible networks, the locks become policies, metrics, and digital infrastructures. The rituals become our daily logins, commutes, and scripted interactions. We voluntarily enact the choreography because we've been taught that deviation carries loss of belonging, income, status, or safety. The cell is self-maintained. That is why modern control requires so little overt force. We've internalized the rules and call them common sense. But here's the paradox. The very same mechanisms that entrap can also awaken. Scarcity can spark invention. Ritual can be rewritten as self-discipline rather than obedience. Myth can be turned from propaganda into shared truth-telling. The Sullivan story warns us but also equips us. Once you can identify the levers, you can refuse them, or use them to build a different order. This is not a call to paranoia, but to perception. Ask yourself, where are you given identity tokens? Where are you being ranked, nudged, or frightened with subtle penalties? Where are you offered rewards that bind you tighter, rather than make you freer? Mapping these pressures is the modern equivalent of finding the basement door. And understand this, you are not alone. Every historical exposure of hidden power, from abolitionists uncovering slave ships to journalists breaking surveillance programs, began with one person refusing to believe the myth, one person naming the pattern out loud. The Sullivan children who finally testified did not just survive, they became witnesses. In the same way, your awareness makes you a witness. In the next, closing section, we'll assemble everything you've learned, showing not only how to see the system, but how to step out of it without waiting for permission. This is the end of the descent, but not the end of the work. You came here to learn the design of captivity. Now you will learn the design of exit. Listen like a man who expects to act on what he hears. Because knowledge without movement is another form of imprisonment. The first thing you do is name what holds you. Names cut like knives through fog. Is it ritual? A feed? A job that slowly trades your time for obedience? A story you will defend because it gives you belonging? Point to it in a single sentence and say that sentence aloud. Naming collapses the spell. It is the same moment the sheriff pulled the cellar door and the light first reached the stone stairs. The architecture is visible, and visibility is the first kind of power. Second, reduce the cues. Constance's children were trapped by sound and routine. Reverse that by removing predictable hooks. Silence notifications. Delete the app that times your attention. Interrupt the ritual one small way every day. Freedom is built from micro-resistances. Each canceled cue is a tiny key you tuck into your pocket. They add up. No single act will topple the machine, but practice reshapes your nervous system. Rewire the reflex, the cage loosens. Third, reclaim your name. If you have been wearing tokens, scores, roles, avatars, stop introducing yourself with them. Enter conversations with a question, not a status. Practice saying, I used to be X, now I choose Y, and mean it. Identity reclaimed is the opposite of the naming ritual that erased those children. It is a violent, necessary reclaiming of story. Fourth, build witness. The machine survives in silence and private shame. Speak to one man, find one accountability. Truth thrives with a witness. The Sullivan case collapsed when enough witnesses refused to stay silent. Your modern basements need the same pressure. You don't need a crowd. You need one honest pair of eyes that don't flinch. Fifth, redesign myth. Replace the stories you were told with operational truths. Replace comfort with competence. Teach the people around you how the conditioning works. Use the language you've learned here. Stories are switchblades, use them to cut the cords. Finally, act with surgical intent. Small, consistent moves beat dramatic spasms. Unsubscribe, disengage, redirect time toward a skill that enlarges your independent agency. Save money in ways that make you less vulnerable to the soft punishments. Learn to tolerate the discomfort of being unmoored. That discomfort is the price of sovereignty. You've carried this knowledge down to the deepest stone. Now rise with it. The Sullivan basement was exposed because someone refused to accept the comforting story. That refusal changed lives. Let your refusal be exact, relentless, and disciplined. Walk out into the light with the ledger in your hand and the map in your head. You won't be the same. Good. You should not be. Emergence is not a single dramatic step into sunlight. It's a long, deliberate walk through aftershocks. When the Sullivan basement was opened, the children didn't become free simply because the door swung wide. They trembled, refused food, hid in corners. Some wept for the woman who had harmed them. Others refused to speak at all. This is what liberation looks like in real time. Messy, uncertain, and frightening. The same thing happens to adults leaving invisible systems today. You may feel anger, grief, or disorientation when you unplug from a ritual or story. That's normal. It's your nervous system recalibrating after years of cues and soft punishment. The first stage of emergence is mourning. You will mourn the lost certainty, the familiar rhythm, even the myths that harmed you. Give that mourning a space. It's not weakness but detox. The second stage is orientation. Without the old signals, you must build a new compass from first principles, what you value, what you will tolerate, what you will not. This requires patience because the freedom muscle is weak at first. The third stage is practice, replacing reflexes with chosen actions, shaping daily routines without outsourcing them to an algorithm, boss, or doctrine. Emergence also means contact with other survivors. In 1835, volunteers and reformers sat with the rescued children day after day, offering calm presence rather than new orders. The children slowly relearned their own names, their own preferences. You need the same steady presence, friends, mentors, community, who don't rush you back into another cage, but also don't let you drift into isolation. Mutual recognition accelerates recovery. Finally, emergence means constructing a positive myth of your own making. Humans live by stories. Without one, the mind seeks another captor. The antidote to manipulation isn't pure skepticism, but authorship. Write your own charter, your own rituals, your own definition of reward. Teach your body to associate freedom with safety rather than threat. You are not leaving the basement to float in nothing. You're stepping into a landscape where you can grow your own architecture. The Sullivan map is no longer a warning, but a tool. Use it to recognize hidden power structures, to help others see, and to design institutions that heal rather than harvest. In the next section, we'll explore how collective action, many people emerging at once, can dismantle entrenched systems without replicating their traps. Emergence at the individual level matters, but collective emergence is where systems actually change. One person escaping a basement can survive. Many people escaping at once can dismantle the stairs, remove the locks, and seal the door forever. History shows this again and again. A hidden practice persists until enough witnesses share their stories, synchronize their refusals, and build something different in public. The Sullivan case only became national news when a small circle of reformers and journalists compared notes and formed a coordinated push. In modern contexts, that same principle holds. Isolated dissent can be dismissed. Organized dissent changes the frame. The first requirement of collective emergence is communication. Survivors and resistors must speak in clear language about what is happening. Euphemisms protect the system, precision wounds it. This is why naming matters. Say, extraction, coercion, manipulation, instead of the softer brand names offered. Call things what they are. The second requirement is mutual protection. When one person steps out, the system can punish them easily. When many step out simultaneously, soft punishment loses its teeth. Shared visibility breaks the isolation loop. Third, build parallel structures instead of only attacking the old ones. The Sullivan children eventually found safety in small, community-run schools and homes that rejected the old methods and offered steadiness. Likewise today, mutual aid networks, cooperative businesses, and decentralized groups give people a foothold outside extractive hierarchies. Parallel structures are living proof that alternatives exist, undermining the myth of inevitability that every system needs. Fourth, practice conflict literacy. Any collective will inherit tensions, egos, and risks of reproducing the same dominance patterns it set out to escape. Make explicit rules about power, sharing, decision-making, and accountability. Rituals aren't inherently bad. They become bad when they erase agency. Use rituals to reinforce transparency rather than control. Finally, collective emergence requires patience. Systems built over decades don't evaporate overnight. Even the Sullivan farm left scars on the land and in the minds of those who lived nearby. Healing and building take time. Measure progress not by instant victories, but by steady erosion of secrecy and steady construction of new habits. In the next section, we'll trace how these principles, naming, mutual protection, parallel structures, and patience, can be woven into a long-term strategy for cultural change, allowing a community not just to exit the basement, but to redesign the house above it. You've come with me this far down the tunnel, and now we reach the black nerve of the story. The point where revelation becomes responsibility. Knowing about the Sullivan basement isn't just historical trivia. It's a living code about power, about what happens when human beings surrender vigilance to an institution, a family name, or a trusted authority. Every system built on domination will disguise itself as care. Every basement will build a house above it, and every generation will be offered the choice: accept the myth or dismantle the stairs. When the basement door was finally torn open in April 1834, the smell of despair didn't stay locked underground. It leaked into the town's churches, the county courthouse, the newspapers, and the private letters of the elite. Men who'd once praised the Sullivans as charitable pillars of the community began rewriting their memories, pretending they'd always been suspicious. Women who'd volunteered their time for orphans discovered they'd been accessories to a machine of hunger and terror. This is how power tries to survive exposure, by scrambling to rearrange the story, by turning accountability into confusion. You are not immune to this dynamic. Every day, your feed, your job, your government, and even your closest circles deploy the same tactic. This is normal. This is necessary. This is benevolent. They count on you forgetting the basement under the house. They count on you not noticing the sound beneath the floorboards. But you have noticed. And once you notice, you can't unsee. The task now is to decide whether you will use this vision or bury it. Real transformation isn't just about consuming dark stories. It's about recalibrating your own senses so you recognize power plays before they mature into basements. It's about becoming fluent in decoding symbols, questioning narratives, and spotting the hidden cost behind any offer of care. You were led here to remember that vigilance is freedom, not paranoia, but disciplined perception. It's the opposite of living chained in the dark, waiting for someone else to unlock you. The next and final descent will be about crossing from knowledge into action, about sealing this identity shift, so you don't just hear forbidden history, but embody the lessons carved into it.